Welcome to Writers Radio. I'm Carol Harmon, your host-producer for this episode, American Bloodlines, Reckoning with Lynch Culture. Published by University Press of Kentucky, this book will launch on October 7th, 2025. I'm joined by its author, American-Canadian writer Sonya Lea, who was born in Owensboro, Kentucky. Her familiar connections to a notorious event in 1936 in Owensboro challenged and inspired her to tackle the subject of systemic racism as practiced then and evident today. The public hanging of a young black man, Rainey Bethea, charged with rape and murder of Leisha Edwards, an elderly white woman, shocked the nation. It was the last public hanging in America. We begin with Sonya reading an excerpt from Chapter 4 of Bloodlines. How could this happen here?
The home we seek is the home we already are. What happens when we shift the camera view from that favored by white people, and indeed by nearly every media outlet in mid-August of 1936, of the black man at the gallows, to one focused on the whiteness that created racialized violence? There, in the photographs and reportage of the day, is the view that white people refused to reckon with. All there was, as far as you could see, were white people in that town square. Owensboro's Rachel Abbott was 5 years old when she woke in the dark and followed her older sister to the gallows, 2 blocks from her home. 81 years later, she told a reporter what happened that day. "I seen what they were doing, but I didn't realize what they were doing. He, Bethea, wasn't crying. He wasn't fussing. Nothing. I guess he just accepted it. But he looked over at the girl that came out of the crowd with him, and he told her, 'I didn't do this.'"
Sonya, you were born in Kentucky and lived there as part of your childhood. How did you become involved in this story about Rainey Bethea?
It came to me when I was at my grandmother's funeral. Neighbors came up to me following the funeral with a sheaf of papers, letting me know that it was an oral interview project they had done with my grandmother, Frances Ralph. And at that time, I didn't know anything about Rainey Bethea or the history of this event. The last public execution in America is what it's known as. And on the way home to Seattle, I opened it up and started to read it, and it was there that I discovered that it had happened, a hanging in Owensboro, Kentucky, where I was born, and also my grandmother's cruel and racist responses to observing what she did that day.
So then you took some time to let that sink in, but you didn't leave it there.
No, I didn't. I went home and researched it, asked my family a little bit about what they knew, but I found a document online that had some good information by one of the county prosecutors in the state's prosecuting office in Kentucky. And we had an interview exchange online, and basically what I was told at that time was that, Rainey Bethea was a criminal. This was all there was to know. The trials looked like every other trial in that historic era. There was nothing to pursue. And the thing was, for me, at that time, I believed all of that.
Yeah.
And I didn't really have what I might consider the internal stamina or awareness to look into how it might be different, how institutions and systemic issues, and looking at, in particular detail, with the crime itself and how the whole white society had been in support of naming Rainey Bethea a criminal, and what that meant for a Black man to be tried. Yes. So I put it away in the garage for like a decade, really long period of time. And it wasn't until after I had written and published my first book, a memoir, and I was trying to write other books, that this material was just pressing up against me constantly. It was like I couldn't write anything until I addressed it. So I decided I wanted to go to the Tin House summer writing workshop, and they had encouraged me to write some new material, to write an essay for admittance. So I decided to do that, and it was all of this family material, as personal material, as well as historically what I knew about that moment in time and how it had been constructed. Got incredible feedback there. Worked with Dr. Lacey Johnson, who is a well-known essayist and memoirist. Got great support from my Tin House colleagues who were there. Came back from that event and really spent the next 8 years writing the book, including 2 years of the book being in a peer review process with the University Press of Kentucky after I sold the book to them. Mm-hmm. So it was a long, arduous project, as I think it should have been.
We return to Sonya's reading from Chapter 4, How Could This Happen Here?
Nearest the gallows were 16 white women, from grandmothers to teenagers to children, who had waited for hours for the execution. Later, many white newspapers would report with horror on the appearance of women and children at the scene, forgetting that white women and their descendants had always been a part of Lynch culture. White women and their babies were featured in much of the coverage, the white journalists unable to grasp the history of white women as perpetrators of lynchings, legal and otherwise. One Texas newspaper clipping was sent to Thompson, which read, "No more shocking spectacle has been seen in this nation in many a year. Half of the crowd assembled to witness the execution were women, young girls, and children. Mothers with babies in their arms and children clinging to their hands fought to get closer to the scaffold."
Somewhere along the line, you discovered that there was another family connection to this story.
That's right. I had been at a family event. I had gone out to Kentucky to go to the archives, go to the major libraries that held this material. I wanted the original source material. And as well, I wanted to interview my family. I wanted to interview my family, not just for what they knew about Bethea, but I wanted to learn about their lives. I wanted to put their lives in context, because I was a sixth-generation Kentuckian who grew up in Canada for the most part. And so my comings and goings had mostly been as an outsider. And I had been the one that they'd ask questions of. And now I needed to really turn the tables and ask questions about their lives, rather than that going through a filter of my parents.
Yeah.
So when I came back, I was looking down at this documentation, and then all of a sudden the words Burkhead floated up to me, and I went, that's a family name. That is my grandmother's mother's family name, my great-grandmother.
Yeah.
And I couldn't sort out how to do it myself on Ancestry.com. I didn't know what documentation would be required. I needed help with the research at that time. So I decided to hire some researchers from Ancestry.com to help me sort out if I was connected to The man I saw as being most responsible for the way the trial went down, which was Herman Burkett. He was the prosecutor for the Commonwealth.
Wow.
Yeah. So I think that took some digesting as well. That now I wasn't just directly connected to this story on my father's side with my teenage newlywed grandparents being at the public execution, but also on my maternal side, someone I saw as responsible for a terribly unjust trial.
We continue listening to Sonya reading from Chapter 4, How Could This Happen Here?
The photographs from August 14, 1936, depict a full range of human emotion on those white faces: fear, curiosity, solemnity, anger, mocking. But there was no denying that the scene in Owensboro had been a grotesque shindig. Reflecting the original meaning of shindig as shindy or ruckus, the event both was and caused a commotion that continues throughout history. The disturbing images the newspapers carried of the hanging day crowd echoed the postcards of lynchings that had circulated for years. In those photographs at the Bethea hanging, there are our white ancestors, the grandmothers with their strong shoulders and gleams of crow-like hair, the men in uniform who prefer to be seen as heroic, the teenagers handing out cold bottles of Coca-Cola, the children who were carried in their parents' arms to witness a cruel death. These were white folks who knew themselves to be protected witnesses in a communal ritual with all of the signals full of white virtue, including feeling morally superior to the black man they would punish. These white bodies had allowed the state to use them as an extension to enact unjust laws, policies, and systems, and had been allowed to think themselves to be decent people in exchange.
Can you tell us a bit about the trial? It's shocking, actually, when you read how the trial unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, interestingly, not unlike the trials of that era. There was a railroaded justice, and they did that by ensuring that the first 12 jurors that would be seated would not be against the death penalty, would all be white, and would all be males. So that is a part of it. The attorneys that they assigned to the case for Rainey Bethea, one included the judge's son.
Mm-hmm.
3 of them were in their 20s, had very little legal experience at all, and they didn't mount a case whatsoever. They offered no commentary whatsoever throughout the trial, no objections, no statements. They didn't allow Bethea to make a statement. It was as if they sat in defense but offered no defense.
Yeah.
And of course, it took the jury, because they were so ready to have that kind of mob justice, 4.5 minutes to find him guilty.
Wow.
And, you know, it's interesting to read some of the newspaper coverage around that time and some of the documentation, because in their view at the time, they thought that they were being exceedingly careful because they didn't allow the mob to enter the courtroom. In these times, in the summer of 1936, the temperatures were extraordinarily high, 107 degrees day after day. And so there would be a crowd gathered outside waiting for Rainey Bethea to exit. And they had developed this kind of side system where they got him through the back and out to a car safely, and then kept him in Louisville until he was ready to be hung. in that time, there were a group of four Black lawyers, who came forward to mount a habeas corpus trial, which is a chance to restate what happened in those events. And there's a separate judge that's placed in charge of that trial. But that judge was also white and also wouldn't have anything to do with seeing the trial as being unjust. Mm-hmm. So that was overturned. It was considered to be an illegitimate contest. And they set a date for an August public execution right on the Ohio River, about 4 blocks from the town square at that time.
Mm. So he was accused of rape and murder of an elderly white woman.
Yes.
But there was a decision early on not to prosecute the murder, only to prosecute the rape.
Right.
Can you speak to that?
Yes. Burke they knew the law very well, and they knew what would create a public execution. In the 1920s, there was a criminal trial of Will Lockett in Lexington, Kentucky. And at that trial, it was decided that he was guilty of rape and murder, and that meant then that he had a public execution in a jail, the same as it would be done today, right, with electric chair. And Kentuckians were very riled up about that. They thought that it should be different. They thought that there should be more punishment, more visible punishment as a result of that event. So what they did was they said for the crime of rape alone, there would be a public execution. And so in this case, Burke had dropped the murder charges so the execution could take place. Mm-hmm.
What's puzzled me about reading this is it's not really a book about whether Rainey Bethea was guilty or innocent.
No. I mean, I don't think that there's anybody that's really questioned whether Rainey Bethea is a criminal. If you go looking on the internet, that's all that he's ever been offered since he was about 14, 15 years old, is being seen as a criminal.
So the idea of innocent until proved guilty didn't enter into this at all?
It didn't, and there wasn't even such a thing as the Miranda laws. I think he had 5 confessions that he made to different officers of the law, including the jailer and police officers and so forth. I think for 2 of them he was drunk. Mm-hmm. I think that confessions can widely be coerced. And there wasn't a Miranda law. There was nothing that could have protected him. Yeah. And I suspect that he also didn't know that he had the ability to not form a guilty verdict at that time. I think he misunderstood. He originally said he was innocent and later changed his plea to guilty, and I think he didn't really understand what he was doing at the time. My sense of it is that because he was Christian and he had recently been baptized in jail and wanted to repent as a sinner for everything that he had done at that time, I think that he associated those 2 things.
Right.
Yeah.
You refer to this as, you refer to the term legal lynching, mm-hmm. As being what that was and what continues today in various situations. Mm-hmm. Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that lynching is a murder which is endorsed through a kind of kinship. Mm-hmm. I mean, the kinship is white supremacy, so it's a really false notion of kinship. But in legal lynching, the justice system takes on the role of the mob.
Yeah.
I had discovered Dr. George C. Wright's work. He's a University of Kentucky professor and president. He's a brilliant historian and the author of a book called Racial Violence in Kentucky. And one of the things that he says about in his book, which deals with legal lynchings as well, kind of always in quotation marks, that term,
Yes.
because they sound opposite to each other. Something that is legal isn't supposed to be a lynching. So Dr. Wright says, ultimately, it's important to distinguish between legal lynchings and extra-legal mob murders, because nothing should obscure the fact that legal lynchings were the most brutal form of racial violence. That is because you're supposed to be in the security of a system.
Yeah.
And so even though, we used horrific methods then, we're still using horrific methods now. All of these horrific methods are coming back to haunt us, particularly in the southern states, and particularly when white victims are involved. But we're supposed to be in an ethical system of justice, and that's particularly hideous when we deny that right to everybody who comes into our system.
Yes.
So, inflammatory term to use, and it's one that in my research and in my talking with Black scholars and academics and absorbing their work, I really do believe that is a necessary word to use here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another aspect I'd like to ask you about is there were two women who were really prominent in this situation. One was the victim, and the other one was the serving sheriff, was she? Or
Yes.
yes.
Yes. Lisha Edwards was the victim who, as you said earlier, was a older woman who was living in a room, essentially a boarding house in the town at the time. And Sheriff Thompson had taken over for her husband after he'd passed away, and for a period of time, which was kind of a customary tradition in that time. They would hold the position until the following election. But in the following election, she was brought in, I think, in a landslide. Mm-hmm. And she was in that position when this was being brought to trial. So one of the pieces that is, I think, really pretty widely known now, that the event was so large in America's imagination because of the visual that white people in general were fixated on, which is that of a white woman pulling the lever that would begin the hanging process. Mm-hmm. And at that time, in the mid 30s or so, there was all of this discussion about women's gender roles and whether they should be given this kind of authority. And also there was time that led up. So the first trial was in June. The hanging was in August. You had this kind of beat over the summer. The journalism was a lot of yellow journalism at that time. The Owensboro newspapers were exceedingly inflammatory throughout this whole period. So you really had a sense of things rising and rising throughout. But I think also one of the main things is that Florence Thompson didn't come forward and say whether she was going to pull the lever or not. In some ways, she caused it by withholding that information instead of making it obvious. I think that she thought, through whatever kind of thing that was affecting her character at the time, that withholding the information would make it go away. But in fact, it worked in just the opposite way.
Yeah. In fact, she didn't pull the lever.
She did not. She hired a hangman as well as someone to orchestrate the gallows and set up the system. Yes.
And one of them was drunk.
Yeah, the hangman who was supposed to pull the lever showed up drunk that day. And if she had investigated him earlier, she might have seen that he had more criminal charges on him than Rainey Bethea did. Yeah. But as a white man, he had been wrung out through the system and never been tried in the same way as Bethea and likely other Black men were at that time.
Yeah.
You kind of got the sense that through this period, there was some type of retraction. There was some type of ways that came through Jim Crow, and that white people felt like they'd been held back from being who they really needed to be in relationship to what they saw as Black criminality. I actually don't see it as that different from what's happening now to people of color in the system. But, you know, there were all kinds of racist and horrific and cruel events that went on surrounding the event, including necktie parties that the sheriff's daughter even participated in. And these would be events. The hanging was at 5 o'clock in the morning, and these would be events that would happen all night long as people got drunk and had parties and found their place around the gallows. And something that probably, you know, would hold maybe 1,000 people, 20,000 people showed up that day. In effect, the purpose of something like this, if the really harmful purpose, is to not just be a message to other Black people. You know, if you should do this, then this is what you're going to endure, but to physically place Black people in harm at the time of events like this, other Black people. And there were 20,000 people in that town. I have walked these streets myself to see what that would have looked like. Went all the way back to the streets that the Black community lived on in a place called Baptist Town. And so they wouldn't want to go near an event like that. They weren't entitled to cover it for Black newspapers. White people had to be hired and brought on board so there could be coverage from another angle. And they feared for their lives during the whole time of this event happening.
So Black people, they were active later on in trying to recontextualize what happened. But at the time, like that mob of 20,000 people would not have included Black people.
No, but there was still activism around the time. There were people who, from the NAACP, who were writing the governor, who were appealing that this should not happen. It's just that in that moment, physically, they couldn't be
there.
No.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This book is about a specific point in time and a specific incident, but it has much broader implications, which you've covered in your book.
I think one of the things that I was challenged to do by my mentor, Lacey Johnson, was to write a piece of cultural criticism. And that's where I started thinking about Lynch culture a lot. And I define Lynch culture as that which makes it easy to punish, you know, Black, Indigenous, people of color in hateful systems than it would be to enact a system of justice. Mm-hmm. So it's really quite a systemic definition, because in Lynch culture, I wanted to look at not just my family's personal connections to this, but how we form families and communities with this kind of insider white ethos, that our myths and stories are told the same way over and over again. And then how does that get connected to communities? And then how does that develop into policies and into our state and national governments? So it really looks at, I mean, that sounds like such a a giant theme to take on, but it really does look at aspects of certain histories in the state of Kentucky primarily, but also in general in the U.S., in the systems that it's developed. And there's a little essay on my experience when I was living in Canada,
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
So, I'll tell you something interesting that happened for me, and because I think this speaks to being a white woman writing about this.
Uh-huh.
I had a really long peer review process, and in that time, which was 2 years, one of the reviewers who they're anonymous, so I don't know who they are, but I know a little bit about their background, and I did know that this was a Black historian and academic, pointed out to me that I hadn't talked about Breonna Taylor, who's from Louisville, Kentucky, where my family lived in the past and still lives today.
Yes.
And that wasn't because I didn't think about Breonna Taylor, but because I was agonized about what had happened in that time. In some ways, it brought me to my knees, what went on there.
Yeah.
And I think because it was such a huge event in my life and in the ways that I'd seen other SAS take it on, I dismissed that I could talk about it at all. And I think that that's a thing that sometimes happens around whiteness as well, is that we often haven't had avenues where we could speak plainly.
And haven't.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you did take it on, didn't you?
I did take it on. I took on, what I see that happened in the Louisville Police Department, and how the activists had moved onto the streets, and the changes in Louisville today as a result of it. And, that's not what the entire book is about, but it is about how the lynch culture got established in Louisville among the police department, and how the city found it very, very difficult to move away from that way of being. I mean, it's still happening today with Louisville just recently decided that they weren't going to be a sanctuary city anymore, and that they were going to allow the president to bring in immigration and customs authorities and run their streets in conjunction with the police instead of standing up to them. So this continues as a form of punishment against people of color without people really interrogating why that continues to happen in southern white cities. And in a lot of places in the South, the numbers of people who are not just criminally punished, but executed when they are charged with crimes that have hurt or impacted white victims are extraordinarily high, 80 to 89%.
Wow.
Of those cases. So we have a system that's breaking down, and that has been for a long time, but continues in the Trump era, kind of unchallenged.
How has it been with you and your family? They've been, in a sense, they've walked this road with you. Can you speak about that?
Sure. I'm still in the process of hearing back from them. I gave everyone an advance copy of the book. And I wanted people to speak about it in their own time and in their own space. What I said when I delivered those books to aunts and uncles and cousins and my siblings was, whether you read this book will not have an impact on our relationship. I have love and want to be in relationship with you, no matter what your relationship is to this material. There's nothing that should be conditional there. And, it took me, 20 years to really absorb. When I started seeing what happened with Rainey Bethea, it has taken me 20 years to absorb. So it should take them some time to really get what's going on. That being said, both of my sisters are, we talk about these subjects all the time. We text information to each other. We share information. They're in Kentucky. They have a completely different experience than I do. When I was writing the book, they were a source of kind of checking and information for me as to what was really going on there. They corrected me on some things that I wasn't aware of. I've always been an outsider with my family, and I think that's a really great artistic position, but it isn't a great position for being a family member. So I'm trying to, with the release of this book, allow people to be where they are and to communicate what they choose to, so as not to make our relationship about the ways that anyone might respond to anything that I'm interested in.
We conclude today's program with Sonya completing her reading from Chapter 4, How Could This Happen Here?
Owensboro and the state of Kentucky, like many places in America, built its Lynch culture through colonialism, genocide, and racial terror. The state's customs, policies, laws, the architecture of its story are saturated in whiteness. But there also existed movements that were counterforces in enacting systemic change. Kentucky was a regular stop for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose brother served as a pastor in Louisville. In 1964, King, Jackie Robinson, Kentucky's civil rights leaders, and 10,000 Kentuckians marched on the state capitol, which, 2 years later, helped pass the Kentucky Civil Rights Act to make discrimination illegal. Sit-ins, pickets, and marches led to landmark victories, and though Louisville integrated its schools after the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education ruling, the 1970s brought clashes in the city and elsewhere over busing of students. There would be generations of movement action before these places in the South registered systemic change. Many, like the multi-generational families on the streets in Louisville following the murder of Breonna Taylor by police, are still protesting to end the violence. Before reconciliation, we must be willing to tell all the truths in our towns. In naming our past, we begin to repair the damage of structural oppression. To belong to a place, we must reckon with the history that many in our communities are, even today, still trying to deny.
Thanks for joining Sonya Lea and myself, Carol Harmon, for this discussion of American Bloodlines, Reckoning with Lynch Culture. The book is published by University Press of Kentucky and will launch on October 7th, 2025. To learn more of Sonya and her writing retreats, visit her website, wonderingwhoyouare.com, and her Substack, Wanderland. Bloodlines may be ordered through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Bookshop. This episode is also a podcast available at our website, writersradio.ca, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to my co-producers, Ingrid Rose, editorial, and Gary Sill, music and technical support. And thanks to you for listening.
You have been listening to Writers Radio, a non-commercial collaborative project which presents talented writers reading their own work. These stories, essays, and conversations revisit the long tradition of oral storytelling that connects us to the inspiration behind the words. Be sure to check the website, writersradio.ca, to subscribe to our free notifications list. It's also a way of letting the writers know you are there and appreciating their creative work.
Writers Radio broadcasts from Half Moon Bay on the Sunshine Coast in Canada, traditional tribal land of the Sechelt Nation of the Coast Salish peoples. We express our gratitude for their wisdom teachings and land stewardship.